The screams hadn't stopped. Not for 3 days. Michael sat at the kitchen table, methodically spooning cereal into his mouth, the television murmuring in the background. His mother's voice had grown hoarser by the second day, but his father's deep bellows still echoed up through the floorboards, demanding release, promising retribution. It didn't matter. The voices in Michael's head were louder. He glanced at the knife on the table. Dried blood still crusted on the handle. He should clean it, he thought distantly. Evidence. But somehow, he couldn't bring himself to touch it again. The doorbell rang, its cheerful chime cutting through the cacophony inside his skull. Michael didn't move immediately. They would ring again. They always did. When the second ring came, followed by a firm knock, he rose slowly, his chair scraping against the linoleum floor. Through the peephole, he could see 2 police officers standing on the porch, faces grim in the morning light. "Coming," he called, his voice surprisingly steady. He unlocked the door and pulled it open, blinking in the sudden brightness. "Michael Devereaux?" the female officer asked, her hand resting casually near her holster. "Yes," he said. "I'm Officer Martinez. This is Officer Dawson. We're responding to a call from your school counselor. She says you've missed 3 days of classes and hasn't been able to reach your parents." Michael nodded, his face a careful mask of neutrality. "They're not available right now." The male officer, Dawson, studied him with narrowed eyes. "Mind if we come in and take a look around, just to make sure everything's okay?" Michael stepped back, holding the door wider. "Sure." As they entered, Martinez's gaze immediately fixed on the knife on the kitchen table. Her posture changed, almost imperceptibly, becoming more alert. "Is that blood on that knife, son?" Dawson asked, his voice suddenly hard. Michael looked at it as if seeing it for the first time. "I cut myself making dinner," he said, the lie falling from his lips with practiced ease. But they weren't listening anymore. Martinez was speaking quietly into her radio, while Dawson's hand was now firmly on his weapon. "Where are your parents, Michael?" Martinez asked again, her tone gentle but insistent. Michael felt a strange calm settle over him, like a shroud. He'd known this moment would come eventually. Part of him had been waiting for it. Another part, the part that whispered constantly in his ear, had warned him. They would come. They always find us in the end. "In the basement," he said simply. Martinez motioned to Dawson, who drew his weapon and moved quickly toward the basement door. The screams grew louder as he unlocked it, more desperate. "We need medics," Dawson shouted, disappearing down the stairs. 2 adults, multiple injuries, conscious and responsive. Michael sat back down at the table, resuming his breakfast, as if nothing had happened. The voices were quieter now, satisfied that the plan had played out exactly as they'd predicted. Officer Martinez approached cautiously, her own weapon drawn. "Stand up slowly, Michael. Keep your hands where I can see them." He complied without resistance, allowing her to cuff his hands behind his back. "Michael Devereaux, you're under arrest for the attempted murder and false imprisonment of Brian and Diana Devereaux. You have the right to remain silent." Her voice faded into background noise as Michael focused on the new voice that had joined the chorus in his mind. "They lived. You failed. Now we'll have to try again." 6 months later, the fluorescent lights in the psychiatric hospital buzzed overhead, casting a sickly glow over the small interview room. Dr. Rebecca Chen adjusted her glasses and studied the boy sitting across from her. At 17, Michael Devereaux was tall and gaunt, with hollow cheeks and eyes that darted constantly, tracking invisible movements in the air. "Thank you for agreeing to speak with me, Michael," she said, opening her notebook. "I'm hoping you can help me understand what happened." Michael's eyes flickered briefly to meet hers, then away, focusing on something over her left shoulder. His lips moved silently, responding to words only he could hear. "For the record," she continued, "this interview is being recorded as part of your ongoing treatment and may be used in your upcoming competency hearing. Do you understand?" A nod. "Nothing more. I need a verbal response, please." "I understand," he said, His voice flat. They understand too. Dr. Chen maintained her professional demeanor. Who are they, Michael? The Watchers. They're always listening. He leaned forward slightly. One is behind you right now. Dr. Chen didn't turn around. Let's start from the beginning. Can you tell me about your relationship with your parents? Michael's fingers tapped a rapid rhythm on the metal table. Which version do you want to hear? The one where they were loving caretakers who didn't understand their troubled son? Or the truth? I want to hear your truth, Michael. He laughed, a sound that started softly and built to something uncomfortable, bordering on manic. My truth? That's what Dr. Mercer used to say too, before they got to him, before he became one of them. Your previous psychiatrist? The reports indicate you stopped seeing him about a year ago. My parents stopped taking me. Say the medications weren't working, that I was getting worse. Michael's voice took on a sing-song quality. But really, they just couldn't afford it anymore after my father lost his job, after he started drinking, after the voices started telling me the truth about them. And what truth was that? That they weren't my real parents. That they were replacements, copies. The originals were taken long ago. Dr. Chen made a note. The court records show you were diagnosed with early-onset schizophrenia at age 12, with subsequent psychotic episodes increasing in frequency and severity over the past 2 years. Do you feel this diagnosis is accurate? Michael's eyes drifted to the camera in the corner of the room. They want you to think I'm crazy. It makes it easier to control me. Who wants me to think that? Everyone. The doctors. The government. My fake parents. His voice dropped to a whisper. They put the chip in my brain when I was sleeping. That's how they broadcast the messages. That's how they control everyone else. Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly. Let's talk about what happened 3 days before the police came to your house. Can you tell me about that? Michael's breathing changed, becoming more measured, deliberate. His eyes focused on something beyond the interview room walls. It wasn't my idea, he began. The Watchers told me what needed to be done, how to free my real parents from the prison dimension. The argument had started the way they always did, over his medication. His father, Brian Devereaux, had discovered empty pill bottles in Michael's bathroom trash, proof that he had been flushing his antipsychotics for weeks. This has to stop, Michael, Brian had said, his voice tight with frustration and fear. The doctors have explained what happens when you go off your meds. You're putting yourself and others at risk. Michael had stood in the kitchen, eyes darting around the room, tracking the shadowy figures that slipped in and out of his peripheral vision. The Watchers were particularly active that day, whispering urgently about danger, about imposters, about the need to act before it was too late. His mother, Diana, hovered nearby, her face etched with the familiar lines of worry that had aged her beyond her 45 years. Sweetheart, please, she'd pleaded. We just want to help you. The medication helps quiet those voices, remember? Helps you think more clearly. They're not voices, Michael had insisted, the words tumbling out in a rush. They're real. They're trying to warn me. About you. About what you've done with my real parents. Brian had moved toward the phone. I'm calling Dr. Winters. We need to get you back on your medication right away. That's when Michael had seen the knife on the counter beside him. The large chef's knife his mother used to prepare Sunday roasts. Take it, asterisk, the loudest voice had commanded. Asterisk. It's the key. The key to the door between worlds. Asterisk. His hand had moved almost of its own accord, fingers closing around the handle. Put that down, son, Brian had said cautiously, noticing the movement. You don't want to do something you'll regret. You're not my father, Michael had whispered, raising the knife. Where is he? What did you do with him? What followed was a blur of motion and sound. Brian lunging forward, trying to disarm his son. The knife slashing wildly, catching his father across the abdomen. Blood blossoming across his white shirt in a strange, beautiful pattern. His mother screaming. The Watchers cheering. Michael had stood over his wounded father, knife still in hand. As Diana rushed to her husband's side, "Call an ambulance," Brian had gasped, clutching his bleeding stomach. But Michael had already been listening to new instructions. the voices now a unified chorus, directing his actions with perfect clarity. "Both of you," he'd said calmly, "down to the basement. Now, or I'll finish what I started." Surprisingly, they had obeyed, either from shock or from genuine fear of their son. His father leaning heavily on his mother as they made their slow, painful way down the basement step. Once they were at the bottom, Michael had backed away quickly, racing up the stairs before either parent could react. The heavy door had slammed shut, the deadbolt sliding into place with a satisfying click. His mother's confusion had turned to panic as she realized what he'd done. "Michael, open this door right now." "I can't do that," he'd replied through the thick wood. "Not until the ritual is complete. Not until my real parents can return." He'd stood there for a long time, listening to his mother's pleas and his father's labored breathing, feeling nothing but a strange sense of accomplishment. The voices were pleased. The first phase was complete. Dr. Chen's pen paused over her notebook. "You said you locked them in the basement to complete a ritual. Can you explain what you thought would happen?" Michael's eyes darted to the corners of the room, checking for eavesdroppers. The watchers explained it all. The basement is a threshold, a weak point between dimensions. After 3 days, the barrier would dissolve, and the imposters would be swapped back for my real parents. "And you believed this would work?" "I knew it would. The voices have never lied to me, not like everyone else." "What did you think would happen to your parents, the ones in the basement?" "They weren't my parents," Michael insisted, his voice rising. "They were copies, replacements. But you knew they could die down there." A flicker of something, doubt perhaps, or guilt, crossed his face before disappearing. "The watchers said it was necessary, a sacrifice to restore balance." "Did part of you know they were your real parents, that they needed medical attention?" Michael's fingers resumed their tapping, faster now. Sometimes, I could hear my mother crying. She sounded just like my real mother used to sound when I was little, before the switch happened." He swallowed hard. "And my father, he kept saying he forgave me, that he just wanted me to get help." "How did that make you feel?" "Confused. The voices got very angry when I started to doubt. They screamed so loud I couldn't think straight." "And yet you didn't open the door." "I couldn't. They wouldn't let me. They said if I opened it too soon, everyone would die. My real parents would be lost forever." Dr. Chen made a note. "Let's talk about your childhood, Michael. Before the voices started, what was life like in your family?" Michael had been a bright, imaginative child. Perhaps too imaginative, his kindergarten teacher had noted with concern. His elaborate fantasy worlds sometimes seemed more real to him than the classroom. He had trouble distinguishing between the stories in his head and reality. His parents had encouraged his creativity, while gently trying to ground him in the real world. Brian, an architect with an artist's sensibility, had given him sketchbooks to capture his visions. Diane, a high school literature teacher, had helped him channel his ideas into written stories. The first significant episode had occurred when Michael was 11. He had become convinced that his classmate Tommy was actually a robot sent to spy on him. The delusion had persisted for weeks, escalating until Michael had attacked Tommy on the playground, trying to find the control panel he was certain existed under the other boy's skin. The diagnosis had followed swiftly: early onset schizophrenia, a relatively rare but devastating condition. The prognosis was guarded. Childhood schizophrenia often presented more severe symptoms and was more resistant to treatment than adult onset forms. For a time, the medications had helped. Michael had attended therapy sessions diligently, learning to question his perceptions when they diverged too sharply from reality. He developed coping strategies for managing the voices when they appeared, techniques for grounding himself during delusional episodes. By 14, he'd been stable enough to return to mainstream schooling. His parents had cautiously celebrated this victory, hopeful that the worst was behind them. But then Brian had lost his job during company-wide layoffs. Financial pressures had mounted. The premium insurance plan that had covered Michael's extensive treatment had been replaced with a basic policy that limited his therapy sessions and required higher copays for his medications. Diane had taken on extra teaching assignments. Brian had found intermittent architectural work, supplemented by bartending shifts that often kept him away from home until the early morning hours. The stress had taken its toll on the entire family. Michael, sensitive to the changing dynamics, had begun to deteriorate, first subtly, then dramatically. He'd started skipping doses of his medication, claiming they made him feel foggy and not like himself. The voices, once whispers easily dismissed, had grown louder, more insistent. His delusions had taken on a new, darker theme, that his real parents had been replaced by identical imposters, that everyone around him was being systematically substituted by these copies who looked and sounded like the originals but weren't quite right. The harder his parents had tried to convince him to resume his medication, the more suspicious he'd become of their motives. Why were they so insistent he'd take pills that dulled his senses, that made it harder to hear the warnings from the watchers? By 16, Michael had developed a complex mythology around these entities he called the Watchers, beings that existed just beyond ordinary perception, who had chosen him to receive special knowledge about the truth of reality. They'd told him he was special, important, the only one who could see the world as it truly was, and increasingly, they'd told him what to do. The medical reports from the hospital indicate your father sustained a serious but non-fatal stab wound, Dr. Chen said, returning to the events of the incident. He required surgery and transfusions, but is expected to make a full recovery. Your mother was treated for dehydration and psychological trauma. They were fortunate that the police arrived when they did. Michael's expression remained blank. They survived because they weren't real. Real humans would have died. That's how I know the ritual was working. Your parents have submitted statements to the court describing their experience in the basement. Would you like to know what they said? A flicker of interest crossed his face. They're not my parents. But yes, your father stated that despite his injury and the circumstances, his primary concern was for your well-being. He wrote, and I quote, "Even as I feared for my life and my wife's, I was terrified for Michael. I knew he was in the grip of a psychotic episode, and that the son I raised the real Michael was lost somewhere inside his illness." Michael flinched slightly, but said nothing. Your mother wrote that she spent much of her time in the basement praying not for rescue, but for you to receive the help you need. She said, I could hear him walking above us, talking to himself, sometimes laughing, sometimes crying. I wanted nothing more than to hold him and tell him everything would be okay, the way I did when he was small and woke from nightmares. A muscle twitched in Michael's jaw. They're lying, trying to manipulate me. That's what they do. Are they? Or is it possible that the voices the watchers are the ones manipulating you? Michael's hands suddenly slammed down on the table. You don't understand. None of you understand. His eyes darted wildly around the room. They're here right now, watching, listening, telling me not to trust you. Dr. Chen remained calm. What are they saying right now, Michael? He tilted his head, listening. They say you're one of them too, that this is all a test, that I failed them by not completing the ritual, and now I'm being punished. His voice dropped to a whisper. They say my real parents are still trapped, and now I'll never find them. Michael, what if the voices are wrong? What if the people in the basement really were your parents, the same ones who raised you, who taught you to draw and write stories, who've been fighting for years to help you through your illness? Tears suddenly welled in his eyes. Then I hurt them for nothing. I almost killed my dad for nothing. His breathing became ragged. But that can't be true. It can't be. Because if it is, then you've been ill, not special. And everything the voices have told you has been a symptom, not a revelation. The tears spilled over. I don't know what's real anymore. I don't know who to believe. Dr. Chen leaned forward. That's why you're here, Michael. To help you separate reality from the delusions. It won't be easy, and it won't happen overnight. But with the right medication and therapy, it is possible. Michael wiped at his tears with his sleeve. What happens to me now? The court has ordered a full psychiatric evaluation before proceeding with your case. Based on my assessment and the testimonies of other experts, a judge will determine whether you're competent to stand trial or require intensive psychiatric treatment before legal proceedings can continue. My parents, he hesitated. They should hate me for what I did. Yet they don't. They've both expressed their commitment to supporting your treatment, regardless of the legal outcome. They understand that your actions were driven by your illness, not by malice. Michael's expression crumpled. I don't deserve that. Not after what I did. This isn't about what you deserve, Michael. It's about what you need. And right now, you need treatment for a serious illness that has distorted your perception of reality and driven you to actions you would never have taken otherwise. As the interview concluded, Dr. Chen couldn't help but reflect on the tragic intersection of mental illness, inadequate health care, and family crisis that had led to this moment. The system had failed Michael long before he had locked that basement door, when financial constraints had interrupted his treatment, when follow-up care had become inconsistent, when the warning signs of his deteriorating condition had gone unaddressed. Now that same system would decide his fate. 1 year later, the juvenile courtroom was smaller than Michael had expected, more intimate, less like the imposing halls of justice he'd seen on television, and more like a conference room with better furniture. His attorney, a public defender named Miss Reeves, sat beside him, reviewing notes in a slim folder. The judge entered, and everyone rose briefly before settling back into their seats. Michael's parents sat in the row directly behind him. He could feel their presence like a physical weight, though he hadn't turned to look at them. He was on new medication, that dulled the voices to distant murmurs most days, that helped him distinguish between the hallucinations and reality. The fog he'd feared for so long had turned out to be clarity instead. Dr. Chen had testified earlier in the proceedings, presenting her comprehensive evaluation of his mental state, both at the time of the incident and currently. Her diagnosis had been unequivocal: paranoid schizophrenia with severe psychotic features. In her professional opinion, at the time of the attack, Michael had been in the grip of a psychotic episode, so profound that he could not distinguish reality from delusion, could not understand the nature or wrongfulness of his actions. The prosecution had pushed back initially, arguing that the premeditated nature of the basement imprisonment showed awareness and intent. But even they had been swayed by the mountain of medical evidence, by Michael's treatment response, and by his parents' unwavering advocacy for his mental health care rather than punishment. After careful consideration of all testimony and evidence presented in this case, the judge began, adjusting her glasses as she read from her prepared statement. This court finds that Michael Devereaux was suffering from a severe mental illness at the time of the offense that rendered him unable to appreciate the nature and quality of his actions, or to know that what he was doing was wrong. Michael's breath caught in his throat. Therefore, in accordance with state law regarding juvenile offenders with serious mental illness, this court orders that Michael Devereaux be committed to the State Psychiatric Hospital for Adolescents for a period of not less than 2 years, during which time he will receive intensive psychiatric treatment and rehabilitation services. His case will be reviewed every 6 months to assess his progress and ongoing treatment needs. The judge looked directly at Michael now, her expression stern, but not unkind. Mr. Devereaux, this ruling is not a dismissal of the severity of your actions. You caused serious physical and emotional harm to your parents. However, this court recognizes that you were not in control of your faculties when you committed these acts. Your continued treatment and recovery must be your highest priority. She turned to address his parents. Mr. and Mrs. Devereaux, the court acknowledges your extraordinary compassion in advocating for your son's treatment rather than punishment. However, I must emphasize that Michael's return to the home environment will only be considered when his treatment team determines that he poses no risk to himself or others, and when a comprehensive home supervision and outpatient treatment plan is in place. As the proceedings concluded, Michael finally turned to look at his parents. His father, still somewhat thin from his ordeal, met his gaze steadily. There was no hatred there, only a profound sadness and determination. His mother's eyes brimmed with tears, but she managed a small, encouraging smile. They were his parents, his real parents. Not imposters, not copies. The people who had raised him, who had fought for him even after he had nearly destroyed them. The realization still hit him anew sometimes, cutting through the last vestiges of his delusions like a blade of truth. As the bailiff approached to escort him back to the psychiatric facility, where he'd been held during the trial, Michael spoke to his parents directly for the first time. "I'm sorry," he said simply, his voice breaking. "I'm so sorry." His father nodded, acknowledging the apology without diminishing its necessity. "We know, son, we know." In the year that had passed since the incident, Michael had begun the long, painful process of separating the phantoms created by his illness from reality. The Watchers still appeared sometimes, still whispered their conspiracy theories and demands, but their power over him had diminished dramatically. With medication, therapy, and the painful clarity of confronting what he had done, he had started to reclaim his mind from the chaos of psychosis. The road ahead would be long and difficult. Schizophrenia was a chronic condition, requiring lifelong management. There would be medication adjustments, therapy setbacks, perhaps even future hospitalizations. The legal consequences of his actions would follow him in some form for years to come. But as he was led from the courtroom toward the transport vehicle that would return him to the psychiatric facility, Michael felt something he hadn't experienced in a very long time. Hope. Not the feverish, delusional hope that had driven him to lock that basement door, but a quieter, more realistic hope that with treatment, with support, with time, he might someday find a way to live with his illness, rather than be consumed by it. The voices disagreed, of course. They always would. But for the first time, he was learning not to listen. 5 years later, the community college campus buzzed with activity as students rushed between classes. Michael, now 22, sat on a bench outside the library, textbooks stacked beside him, waiting for his next class to begin. His phone vibrated with a text message notification, his mother reminding him about dinner that weekend. He smiled faintly as he responded, confirming he'd be there. 5 years had transformed him in ways both visible and invisible. The gaunt, wild-eyed teenager had given way to a lean young man with thoughtful eyes and a courteous demeanor. The inner transformation had been even more profound. He had spent 2.5 years in the psychiatric hospital, gradually progressing from the secure ward to a transitional program that allowed him greater independence while maintaining strict oversight of his medication compliance and mental state. Upon release, he had moved into a group home for young adults with serious mental illness, where he had continued outpatient treatment while completing his high school education. His parents had remained constant throughout, visiting regularly, participating in family therapy sessions, slowly rebuilding the trust and relationship that had been shattered by his psychotic break. The medications had been adjusted numerous times, seeking the delicate balance between controlling his symptoms and minimizing side effects. There had been setbacks periods when the voices grew louder, when paranoid thoughts crept back in around the edges of his consciousness, when the effort of distinguishing reality from hallucination became exhausting. But there had been progress too. Significant, life-changing progress. Now he lived in a supervised apartment near campus, sharing space with another young man in recovery from bipolar disorder. He attended community college part-time, studying graphic design field that allowed him to channel his creative impulses while building practical skills. He saw his psychiatrist monthly, his therapist weekly, and took his medications without fail. The voices never disappeared entirely. The Watchers still whispered to him sometimes, especially during periods of stress or poor sleep. But he had learned to recognize them for what they were: manifestations of his illness, not revelations of hidden truth. He had developed strategies for reality testing, for grounding himself when the delusions threatened to take hold. His relationship with his parents had evolved into something new, more adult, more honest, shaped by the trauma they had shared, but not defined by it. His father, fully recovered physically from his wound, had become an advocate for improved mental health services, speaking openly about their family's experience. His mother had joined a support group for parents of children with serious mental illness, finding purpose in helping others navigate the complex healthcare and legal systems. As Michael gathered his books and headed to his next class, he passed a campus security officer. There had been a time when such figures triggered immediate paranoia, when uniforms of any kind represented threat and conspiracy. Today, he nodded politely and continued on his way, the interaction unremarkable. It was these small victories, these moments of ordinary interaction untainted by psychosis, that marked his progress most visibly. The ability to ride a bus without searching for hidden messages in advertisements. The capacity to meet new people without analyzing their movements for signs they were imposters or agents of some shadowy organization. The freedom to simply exist in the world without constant fear. His life had been irrevocably altered by his illness and by what he had done during its worst manifestation. The legal record of his actions, though sealed as a juvenile offense, remained a fact of his history. The knowledge of what he had been capable of during psychosis would always be with him, a sobering reminder of why his treatment was not optional but essential. Yet within these constraints, he had found a way forward. Not the life he might have had without schizophrenia, but a life with purpose and connection nonetheless. A life that honored the second chance he had been given by the court, by his treatment team, and most incredibly, by the parents he had nearly killed. As he took his seat in the classroom, Michael briefly closed his eyes, performing the quick mental check that had become habitual, grounding himself in the present moment, acknowledging the reality around him, quietly reaffirming the boundary between what his senses told him and what his illness might try to invent. The voices were quiet today, not gone, never completely gone, but manageable. Background noise rather than commanding presence. "You doing okay?" asked Lily, a classmate who knew something of his history, sliding into the seat beside him. Michael opened his eyes and offered a small but genuine smile. "Yeah," he said. "Today's a good day." And in that moment, despite everything, despite the illness that would require lifelong management, despite the memories that would never fully fade, despite the limitations that his condition imposed, it was true. Today was a good day. One day at a time, one moment at a time. He was learning to live in a broken world with a mind that sometimes betrayed him. It wasn't justice, exactly. There could be no true justice for a tragedy born not of malice, but of mental illness, an illness that had victimized both Michael and his parents in different ways. But it was something perhaps more valuable, a reckoning, a reconciliation. A careful, fragile peace built on medication, therapy, forgiveness, and the daily choice to face reality as it was, not as the voices would have him believe it to be. The professor called the class to order, and Michael opened his notebook, ready to focus on the lesson at hand. Behind him, just at the edge of hearing, a watcher whispered that it was all an illusion, a conspiracy, a trap. Michael acknowledged the voice, then gently let it go, returning his attention to the real world before him. He had learned the hardest way possible, which voices to trust. Now, finally, one of those voices was his own.